All right, I guess we're live. Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone from Bangladesh and South Asia, and good morning to everyone in America. This is actually our webinar from Student Liberty, the world's biggest pro-liberty organization on pop culture and individualism. Today, our guest is Sean Malone. Sean is the creative director for Foundation of Economic Education. He's responsible for the amazing series he makes, video series he makes on pop culture and other issues of individual and economic freedom, whose names are out of frame. So with much further ado, let's start. Sean, could you please tell a bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hey, thanks for inviting me to do this. It's a nice early morning here in Atlanta. I'm excited to be here and talk to you guys though. So yeah, as Straw said, I'm a creative director for the Foundation for Economic Education. My background is, I'll go through it really quickly, is all pretty much in entertainment and media. I worked for a little bit. Well, I'll start at the beginning. I started actually as a musician and a composer, and have 2 music degrees, graduated with a master's from New York University, worked in the commercial music industry in New York City, and then in the music industry in Los Angeles for a few years. And around 2009, 2010, I started getting really interested in the idea of making my own video content. I was working as a composer for film and video projects, as a music editor, music supervisor, those kinds of things. And but I was doing things that I really didn't enjoy that much, and working on projects that didn't really excite me. And there were, at the same time, a whole lot of discussions going on around the economy and the financial collapse in 2007, 2008, and all of that kind of stuff was happening. And so I wanted to start doing some things that I thought might make a difference to helping people understand what I thought and still believe are much better ways of understanding those kinds of issues. So I started making videos. The very first one that I made actually was based on a Foundation for Economic Education article by Steve Horwitz called Profit, Not Just a Motive. And it talks about a lot of the same ideas I end up talking about on Out of Frame a lot, which is the use of knowledge in society, the decentralization of knowledge, individualism, profit in this case being about, you know, a way of generating signals to people on what's valuable, what's not valuable. And so that did okay, and I got to show it to a handful of people, and some people at Fee liked it, and so I met Larry Reid, and that was about 10 plus years ago. And then you know, flash forward a little bit, I worked, you know, as a freelancer doing this kind of work for a while. I worked in Washington, D.C., doing this kind of work for nonprofit organizations and in journalism, and then in video journalism. And then I came down to Atlanta in 2016 to create a creative department for Fee, which Fee had never had before. So started doing that, and yeah, in 2017 I started the Out of Frame series. We have a bunch of series, YouTube series with Fee. We produce a ton of live streams. We produce a ton of creative content. I'm really proud of the team that I built over the last few years, and you know, of that, probably the flagship is Out of Frame, which is my video essay series, as Israr said. So that's, yeah.
Thank you, Sean. It's been really helpful for us all to understand like the ideas and concepts about it. So I want to know about it. Like, so what exactly made you a freedom fanatic? Because you do talk a lot about individual and economic freedom both hands, because they're both related to you. Really, what you make. So I would like to ask you on one hand, like, what exactly inspired you to pursue freedom, especially in a place like, you know, FP?
Yeah, actually, that goes way back. So when I was 14 or 15 years old, I think, and this is well before. I mean, I'm 37 now, so there's a lot, you know. I mean, like when I was doing this stuff, there was no real internet or there was no SFL, like none of that stuff existed, right? And what I was doing was thinking about philosophy and thinking about what I believed about the world, and I started asking questions like, who who owns, like, is it possible to own somebody else? Is it possible, who owns me, right? Like in a broad philosophical sense, like, does somebody else get to make decisions for me? Do I get to make decisions for other people? And my answer to all of those questions was no. No, I think individuals are not only best suited to make decisions for themselves in the overwhelming majority of cases. I mean, like, obviously we can talk about edge cases, people, children and people with mental handicaps and things like that. But that's not, that's not the bulk of the cases we're talking about. Overwhelmingly, I came to the belief that it was the individual who was the rightful owner of their own existence, and that my it was not my job or responsibility or even moral authority to tell anybody else how to live. And that answer kind of snowballed into a whole lot of other answers to philosophical questions that kind of lead you down this path a little bit. Because for me, it really started with freedom, and it started with the idea that there really wasn't a moral justification for being able to tell other people what to do based on your preferences. And over the years, that's developed and gotten more sophisticated, and I've learned that, outside of just my own kind of musings on it, that there's an entire body of philosophical literature and, political science literature, and there's all kinds of stuff dating back, 300-400 years and more, even if you want to go back farther than that, that gets to some of these same ideas. So I had a couple early experiences where I was able to read some things, early in college. I think it was a freshman in college. I read Voltaire, and I read Montesquieu, and I read Locke, and a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers played a big role in my thinking on that kind of stuff. And then probably by the end of college, maybe into grad school, I was starting to be interested in, and again, I went to grad school for music, but I was already at that point as a hobbyist super interested in economics, because I'm just interested in human behavior. And economics is such a huge facet of human behavior. I'm also maybe equally interested in psychology and neuroscience and those kinds of things. But just as a hobbyist and as somebody who's interested in the way that people interact with each other. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from. But it didn't come from like any particular epiphany or any book or anything like that. Most of the books I'd read were more helpful in allowing me to be more sophisticated, I think, at thinking about these kinds of things. But stuff like Voltaire's Candide probably made a bigger impact on me than most other things. And then, as I was saying just before we started, F.A. Hayek's Use of Knowledge in Society is an essay that I just feel like everybody should read and really, really grok. But and if that's not, I mean, Hayek's a pretty tough read in a lot of ways, because he was writing, he was not a native English speaker, and he was writing in English, and it's very dense anyway, because it's kind of how he writes. But instead, you could always read I, Pencil by Leonard Reid, which is a very similar theme, and meant to be, easily understood by people. And it's something that, Leonard was the founder of FEE, for those who don't know. And if you go back and read, this is what I've done since I've been at FEE, actually, is read a lot more Leonard Reid. And I've been constantly impressed by his eloquence and his ability to formulate really easy to understand versions of a lot of these ideas. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from. But yeah, I mean, I'm just so glad that organizations like SFL exist now, because I was completely isolated when I was a kid. I mean, when I was a teenager, there was no, there was nothing really. It was just me by myself thinking about what I believed, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. You actually quote Voltaire's Candide. Voltaire was obviously this satirist, he was a dramatist, but again, he was an artist himself. So I want to ask you, the art itself has always been censored in many parts of the world. It's been known as like this, authority. It's been actually challenging authority. So I wanted to ask you on what do you think of art's role in today's world? Because we have polarized identities, we have collectivism, we have, everyone is so much polarized in time. given though we're more connected with the internet, but the internet is also polarized on many terms that way, right? On what offensive and offensive. So I want to ask you an artist's place in today's world, because you're an artist, you emphasize on art a lot. I want to ask you your views on that.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go back and talk about what you said first, which is that art tends to be censored by, not just by governments, but by all kinds of groups who are uncomfortable with it. And I think part of the reason that is the case is because art has the power to shape the way that people think and to communicate ideas beyond a sort of, I don't want to say words alone are sort of two-dimensional, but they are in a sense, in that, like, when you combine words or you eliminate words and you use imagery and music and use all of the artistic tools at your disposal, what you're doing is you're communicating emotion to people, you're communicating feeling, you're communicating intensity of expression in a way that words on paper just aren't usually capable of doing, at least not in a very factual sort of based way. I mean, obviously there's brilliant dramatic writing as well, but I think that that's what it is. I think that art is terrifying to authoritarians because art can challenge the way that people think and feel and reframe or recontextualize something that is going on in society in a way that is not controlled by the majority in power, or whoever happens to be in charge, and so it's scary, and it's something that I understand why authoritarians tend to ban art fairly quickly, or tend to try to control it, right? Try to put it in a box and say, like, this is, you can make art as long as it glorifies the state, or you can make art as long as it glorifies the religion or whatever it is that happens to be the dominant thing in power. But I think art's role in the world today is the same as it's always been, to communicate and to expose deeper truths about humanity in one way or another, right? And to connect people. One of the things that made me interested in music, and the reason that partly the reason that I love composition musically, is because it is a purely abstract form. It is that there is nothing about music by itself. It's just sound waves, right? Like, it's not like if you show an image of a horse, like, somebody kind of knows, like, well, that's a horse, right? But you can represent horse in a piece of music purely through sound waves, and that is completely universal if you have any other contextual understanding. It's the thing that kind of makes all of this really interesting to me, is that you can communicate across cultures, you can communicate across time even, right? Like, you can listen to music or watch a film from 100 years ago and understand the emotions that are being conveyed. You can understand the ideas that are being expressed. And I don't think there's not much that has more power to shape the way that people think and feel. Certainly not more effectively than art. And I tend to think that film is probably the pinnacle of that we've discovered so far, because it incorporates basically all other art forms. It incorporates visual design and photography and writing and drama and music and and live performance, and all of those aspects come together to create something that expresses an artist's point of view, and it's also why I think art, for me anyway, I think it's important to be critical of art, and I think it's important to review what art you're consuming and think about what the ideas are, which is a lot of why I do Out of Frame, is because there's so much stuff in movies, even pop culture, right? In Marvel movies and stuff, that you can draw out and talk about, because there are ideas being expressed. I think we wanted to talk about Civil War here, and and I recently did another episode on Captain America: Winter Soldier, and there are very clear themes that you know, in Winter Soldier that the Russo brothers are trying to get across. They're very clear things they're trying to get across in Civil War. And I think we should be able to talk about that stuff. Um, and I think it's way more effective to present those themes that way than it is for me to write a white paper about it and you know, like an academic paper or a book report or whatever. I mean, nobody really cares about that stuff, but they definitely care about great stories, you know. So that's what, I guess that's my answer. I think that's what the role is, still is, to communicate and to connect people across cultural lines.
It's interesting because you're using art to criticize art, to critique it, to analyze it as well. It's really
Sure.
interesting you're doing that. I mean, that's what art itself is. It's actually constantly evolving, changing. So
Yeah.
I think for a lot of us here, as we're saying, is that we actually do love a lot of the Marvel heroes, Avengers itself. So it's funny. I wanted to like ask you this question itself. Like, since you've been making a lot of videos on this, in when it comes to cinema, which is actually, let's say, the global language for art itself in so many ways. In asking about Avengers in Civil War, whose side do you think who had a right side? I mean, your video actually says it was Captain America. I would ask you itself in this world because everyone wants to have control because
Yeah.
everyone like, from both the left and right, they actually see chaos happening any other way. If we did have a superheroes team, no one would want the superheroes to be controlled by one government or
Yeah.
one group of countries, and superheroes
Yeah.
would like to be free. But again, there's chaos. So in that decision making process, if you could let us know about what you think of it itself, because we're all nerds here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in the video that I made, so if people haven't seen it, I come down pretty hard on the Captain America side of that question. But maybe I should explain why a little bit, is because I think Iron Man, and Iron Man, by the way, as written, Iron Man is a fantastic character. The arc is phenomenal. I mean, like the way that Tony Stark goes from being a completely selfish, kind of self-absorbed character to being, you know, the hero that Captain America actually challenges him to be in the Avengers. It says, you know, you're not the guy to lay down on the wire as somebody else goes across. And then it turns out that Tony Stark is that guy multiple times throughout that series, even, you know, at the end of Avengers. But then of course, you know, in Endgame, you know, Tony Stark really does develop and grow, and it's a great character. But he's also, especially as we get through Avengers and into the rest of the canon, he is a very authoritarian character. He's very fear-based. He's seeing threats to the world, and he's saying, like, the only way to deal with these threats is to create more control and more power that isolates and sort of encapsulates humanity in this shield that also doesn't prevent, that would also prevent them from being free, right? And sort of imprisons the world at the same time as you know, secures it, right? Or makes it safer. And that's exactly what, this is why, like, Age of Ultron is not as popular of a movie, but actually Age of Ultron is one of the more interesting ones to me, because Ultron is the embodiment, and he even says it, he is the embodiment of Tony Stark's philosophy. Like, he is the child of Tony Stark's mind. And what Ultron does is say, hey, I want to save the world. Well, there's no way for me to do that without completely dominating the world, right? And we see this in, I mean, I've seen it. I can't speak for other countries so much, but I can speak for America. Well, not speak for me, you know what I mean? Like, I can speak about America. Is, you know, when 9/11 happened, you know, I was a freshman in college when that happened, and it was a big deal, obviously, but like, it was such an anomaly and such a surprise in America that I was eating breakfast at the cafeteria in my college, and they had it on TV, and we all thought it was like a movie or something. We thought it was like a trailer to a movie. And it was only until that kept going on, and that it was like, now it's on CNN, it's on loop, and we go like, hey, let's turn the sound on to these TVs, like, what's going on, that anybody realized that, like, this was happening, you know, in real time. And one of the first things, because again, I was already pretty confident that I had a philosophical base at this point. So, like, one of my first instinctive reactions to this was like to be worried that the policy reaction was going to be to lock down, to create more power structures, to create more governmental agencies, possibly to go to war, which obviously happened, to use the military and the state to impose some authoritarian structure that was that they claimed would be designed to save us from future attacks, but which would most likely just kind of imprison us. And that really, a couple months later, the Patriot Act comes out. A few months after that, we're starting to talk about Afghanistan, and a year later, we're starting to talk about Iraq and all of these things. And it just all kind of came to pass from that instinctive, fear-based mindset of like, we need to get power to stop the bad guys, basically. And that's kind of what Iron Man is doing the whole time, and he's also like shockingly willing to abdicate the decision-making authority to groups like the UN, which, in the real world have an awful track record of making these kinds of decisions. And so to that extent, I think that Iron Man is just clearly in the wrong. Of course, that video has been up for a while, and I've dealt with a lot of comments on the video and other people's perspectives. And one of the perspectives that people come back to a lot is a more emotional perspective, which is that Captain America allowed Tony Stark's, like the person who killed Tony Stark's parents, to go free. And so it becomes more about like loyalty and friendship and, and justice for Tony Stark's parents and those kinds of things. And to that extent, I think that that's fair. I think Captain America should have been more helpful in terms of bringing Bucky in and those kinds of things in Civil War. But still, at the same time, I think the core battle between the idea of individuals making decisions based on their best knowledge and based on local knowledge versus a governmental authority making those decisions from 30,000 feet in the air, not really understanding what's going on in specific cases, not really understanding what everybody's values or roles are. I think it's clear that, at least to me, that Captain America has the better philosophical position, and it's the more individualist position. It's the position that's saying, I am, you can take me to task for doing something wrong if I do something wrong, but I am the one who is best equipped to make decisions for my own body, for, the role that I play in the world and all those kinds of things. And, of course, also he's right, because the UN Security Council and all these other things are wildly corrupt and, Hydra influenced and all that kind of stuff. So, I think there's pretty clear case inside the framework of the movies, but it's also, I think, really important to see that play out in real life, where, these institutions are not infallible. They're not filled with people who just want the best for everybody all the time. They're filled with human beings who have their own interests to further, and also they're filled with human beings trying to centrally plan entire societies, and that just doesn't work.
One of the
Hopefully that was an
parts,
answer.
that's a great answer, because I think you're right about the United Nations. That's how I've got to know a lot about what the UN did in terms of its food crisis in 1990s as well. But there's a part where Steve Rogers says the fact that that people in the UN have agendas, and agendas change.
Yeah.
And that's how they're using us. So I think that was like really good, because when I was watching the film, I was watching the film again, like, okay, wow, he has a point in there as well. So this idea, again, we go back to Hayek, is because Tony Stark is trying to centralize everything in one place, and he's not allowing. He wants to bring everyone under one condition, and that doesn't work that way. It leads to complete perpetual chaos in society, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about a little more about Hayek's. Like, how do you derive Hayek's use of knowledge, his essay on that, in pop culture itself? Like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, so what I think is so important about that idea, and the idea that knowledge is decentralized, is also a little bit of humility, right? It's understanding that, like, I don't have every answer to every problem, And neither do you, neither does anybody listening to this, right? Like none of us has all of the answers. And what's great about a free society is that we all get to offer our own opinion on what those answers, what solutions to societal problems actually are, you know? And this you see most clearly in terms of entrepreneurship, right? Entrepreneurship is the role of the entrepreneur effectively is to offer solutions to problems that they hope are, one, valuable to the people they're attempting to be customers, right? But they're also in the context of, is it valuable enough to justify the expense? Because there are other competing uses for the same resources. There are other competing ideas for how to solve problems. You know, one of my favorite examples of this is the invention of the airplane, because Samuel Langley, who nobody really is that familiar with now, although he was the director of the Smithsonian Institute at the time, and he was in the early 1900s, he was the world's, or at least America's, foremost aviation expert, right? The government, the United States government, paid him the equivalent of what is today millions of dollars to develop an airplane he was never able to do, but the Wright brothers, who were bicycle repairmen from Ohio, did, you know, on a fraction of the cost, because they were thinking like entrepreneurs, where Langley was thinking like essentially a government contractor who could keep pulling money and resources to do something. And there wasn't really that much feedback. There was no market feedback, certainly for him, as to whether or not his solutions were effective or were cost effective or any of those things. So the reason I go to that point is that, like, this works for everything. I don't have all the right answers for everything. You don't have all the right answers for everything. But if we come together and we are both free to offer our solutions to different problems, then one, or maybe somebody else's or whatever, will start to rise to the top over time. But if I just say, I have all the answers, I'm going to impose all my answers on everybody else, then we're not going to get progress over time. We're not going to get innovation over time. We're not going to get better ways of doing things or better ways of thinking about things, because all it is me imposing my belief structure on everybody else and not benefiting from this, the millions and millions, billions of people on this planet who all have good ideas and who all have contributions to make, you know. And when we're doing that, it just feels like such a loss to humanity to me. It feels like such an incredible loss to, like, look around the world and see billions of people who are, you know, who all have the potential of being creative and intelligent and skillful, and who have ideas and ways of solving different problems. And then I just go, no, I don't care about any of what you guys think, right? Like, no, I have my one way. My one way is how we're going to do everything. That's not a good way to live, and it's not how we're going to make a world that is getting better and better over time, right? And it's not how we did do that either. You know, we really made huge advancements by opening up society to diverse viewpoints and a lot of freedom for people to, you know, create and explore and experiment and offer their ideas and their products and goods and services to the world, you know. So that's why I think Hayek's use of knowledge in society is so important to understand, is because it gives you that sense of humility and helps you think, or helps you realize, I guess, that you don't have all the answers, and that's okay, because we get to benefit from everybody's answers if we have freedom and a price system and feedback mechanisms, you know.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. You're saying, oh, I think one of the things, especially today's world, is that I think the art of self-criticism is also very important. And we live in a world where, like, criticizing yourself means, going into collective identity. And we have that. We do have that. I think one of the important points you also made with superhero movies is that, as well, they also face moral dilemmas. So I wanted to ask you this important question because of what's ever happening right now, especially related to in relation to your latest video you made. how important do you think is the art of self-criticism? Because not everyone is willing to criticize themselves or the communities because has a sense of being ostracized. I think that's one of the biggest downsides of collectivism is that you're being put in a box of a certain label and you're allowed to make have any nuances within the label itself. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think of self-criticism and art itself?
Oh, I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. So I'll talk about this from two different perspectives. One, from just a pure artistic standpoint. I don't know who in the audience is interested in creating art for themselves, or if they're interested in getting into that kind of world. But I got to say, like, being brutally honest and having other people who are brutally honest with you about your work is the only way that you will get significantly better over time. And one of the things that was most terrifying and also best about graduate school for me, and actually undergrad as well, was what you call colloquium, which is basically a bunch of for me anyway, bunch of composers sit in a room and you play whatever it is, or you show them whatever it is that you're working on, and you get their unfiltered feedback, right? That's the goal, is to get their raw criticism of what you're doing. And it's painful, right? Like you're putting this up in front of a bunch of people who you're already a little nervous that they're better than you, right? Like there's all these people in the room that are very good, and they're all telling you what they don't like and what they do like, but they're telling you what's wrong with your piece, you know. But the same thing is the way that, if you've read, and I would encourage anybody to read this, by the way, Ed Catmull's book, Creativity Inc., which is about the inner workings of Pixar. And what Ed did that I think is so incredibly valuable and probably essential to their overall success was try really, really hard to create an environment where that kind of feedback is constant. So they do the same thing. They get drafts of movies and they get together and they show everybody in the organization these drafts of the films, excuse me. And then what Ed also did, which I think is really smart and something that I try to adopt as much as possible at FEE even, is to try deliberately to have the lowest status people speak first, so that they are not influenced by high status people, you know, stating their opinion. Because otherwise you might have a situation where, you know, let's say Brad Bird says, well, you know, here's what I think. And then everybody else lines up and goes, oh, yeah, I agree, because Brad Bird, you know. But what you want is for everybody to give their actual opinion on it, and then to be, as the director or the producer, to be reflective and self-critical. Okay, I see that. I think that's an issue that I'm going to solve. And it's always up to the director and the producing team to decide how to deal with the criticism, which I think is also super important, because you shouldn't have outsiders telling you how to make your movie. But at the same time, you want everybody's feedback because you want to be as honest with yourself and with your project as possible. So I think that's utterly essential. On a societal level, I think the same rules sort of apply, right? I think we all need to recognize, again, that we don't have all the answers. So being able to step outside of the tribal stuff that we so often deal with on the internet, where it's like, you know, like you watch people do this all the time on the internet, where they get really ensconced in a position because to back down is to let down their tribe, right? To, like, my conservatives or my liberals or my progressives or whatever. And, you know, I can't admit wrongdoing, because if I do, the whole tribe gets embarrassed and they'll hate me. That's really bad. I mean, that's really unhealthy for people's intellectual development, right? You have to be able to step back and say, oh, you know what? You had a good point. Or, you know, I thought it was this way, but I'll think about it a little bit more. Maybe you have something to contribute here, you know? And the funny thing is, ironically, I also think that if you are more humble about that in your online interactions with people, the tone of those interactions tends to de-escalate and get much cooler. Because then if you admit that you don't know everything, the other person feels free to admit that they don't know everything. quite a lot of the time. And then you can actually have a one-on-one conversation rather than just berating each other with like, no, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. You know? So yeah, I think that question is really nice because I think it's so important to be self-critical as an artist, but I also think that self-criticism should extend into the realms of society. They're not just arts driven or project driven in a way. So
Yeah. So I think I'm a big comic book fan. So I think my first superhero was Spider-Man actually. So and I read a little bit more about how these comic book characters were created and whatnot because of America's during World War II with the Nazis and whatnot. So I also wanted to ask you in this regard itself about amongst the comic book heroes. This is a question: who do you think is the most liberal, open-minded comic book superhero you think of?
oh man.
Because every one of them has like is actually has groups and whatnot, right? So it's going to ask.
So I'm going to say, so I did recently do an Out of Frame episode on Superman. And Superman is one of my is really my all-time favorite character. But there's a caveat to that, which is that Superman is often written really badly. So there are incarnations of Superman who I do think fit that. Like if you read, and I talk about it pretty extensively in the video, but Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman, that version of Superman absolutely is that. Like he's really the epitome of somebody who is open and liberal and understands that people are individuals and need to be treated accordingly. And he's also the embodiment of a tremendous amount of compassion and charity at the same time. So even if there's somebody who he disagrees with or who is in fact even a villain, right? He is still working to find ways of helping them understand a better way of thinking rather than just trying to destroy them or beat them up, you know. um I mean there are some other good instances of that though. I mean I think there are some more kind of lesser known characters that I feel operate this way too, although they don't always get credit for it. Beast from X-Men I think kind of works that way. It's kind of more, and Beast is a little bit rare for the intellectual characters in the Marvel world because so many of the intellectuals are just authoritarians. Like Reed Richards is terrible most of the time. You know, he's just trying to control everything literally all the time. But um, I don't know. I'm gonna stick with Superman on this one because I think that in the right hands, in the hands of somebody like Grant Morrison, I think he embodies those values really perfectly. I think a lot of the other characters, um, I think there are really good moments in a lot of different comics for a lot of individuals, but Superman for me is from a symbolism standpoint kind of reflects that, right? He is like the immigration symbolism coupled with the value of individual liberty that kind of comes with the kind of the American way, truth, justice, and the American way idea. Like that's what that actually is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be, you know, this kind of jingoistic, you know, rah American government, but it's openness. It's about the melting pot idea that we're supposed to value, you know. So yeah, I think I'm going to stick with Superman on that one.
It's interesting you're talking with Superman because Superman is also an immigrant, and that also shows an openness to its cultures and ideas as well. Because I think I don't think you've read this part. It's one of this like Superman Red Sun. Have you read that?
Yep.
What do you think of that part? That's another version of Superman who's like very centralized, who wants to control
Yeah.
people. But again, he learns an important lesson. I mean, people like talk about that.
Yeah. So Red Sun, you know, they actually just did an animated movie of Red
Film.
Sun, which I
Yeah.
watched not too long ago. But I'm okay with stuff like that because it's always like interesting to do kind of Elseworld stories and kind of alternate universe versions of things. But it also always kind of bums me out. But I think I think it got it to a large extent. I think it got it right. Like if you grew up in a collectivist society and you grew up under a totalitarian regime and you were the one who had all the physical power in the world, like you would probably grow up with those values and decide to use those values for authoritarian purposes, you know. And so I can't really fault the writing of it in that sense, but it just always kind of bums me out a little bit to see Superman redone as an evil character, because it just kind of ruins that aspect of it for me. Like, Injustice does the same thing, where it's like the Superman character is just horrible, tyrant because Lois Lane died or whatever. And it's just, I don't know. Again, I think Elseworld stories are fine, and they're like all the what ifs. They're always fun to play around with. I just kind of wish they weren't so prominent, because now I always feel like I'm seeing more of those stories get told than the heroic positive stories. And if it was like a 9-to-1 heroism and then the occasional Elseworld story thrown in that was like, hey, what if Superman was a bad guy? I'd be like, okay, cool. But now it's like, what if Superman was a bad guy? And then like every so often you're like, hey, maybe Superman could be good. Who knew? Like it's a weird thing that we've kind of gone that direction culturally, where it's like everything is awful, and all the characters, all the heroes are anti-heroes basically. And I don't love that. I kind of would like to get away from that in general. But again, Red Sun was written a long time ago. It's not, it's not to blame for everybody wanting that today, wanting, Punisher type stories today. But
yeah, interesting. Sean, we have some questions. Would you mind answering them?
Yeah,
All
sure.
right. We have a question. Yeah, sorry.
No, go for
We
it.
had a question. We got a question from Ashwinar. He is asking, "What is your opinion about the show The Boys on Amazon Prime? It showed us a different side of the superheroes. That all their actions, although on the outside looks like good intention, it actually has a lot of side effects. So, would you have anything to say about that?"
Well, I did a whole Out of Frame episode on The Boys. And so you can check that out for a more comprehensive version of that. But yeah, actually, I think The Boys, in the context of the story itself, I think The Boys is really well done. Like the Boys is well, not The Boys, but the seven, the superheroes are what they would have become if you had genetically engineered these heroes and then raised them in a lab with no humanity and no good values and amoralistically and whatever, and then you'd made them operate on behalf of essentially a government contractor. Like, yeah, I mean, they're gonna be amoral and terrible for the most part, and it is terrifying if you have somebody like that. That's why I think superhero stories, I mean, you got to think of superhero stories as mythology, right? And mythology is, it's always been used as both cautionary tales and stories to emulate, right? And characters to emulate. And in The Boys, it's obviously cautionary tale of power corrupting and power, especially with no morality attached to it, is very, very dangerous. And that's what we see in The Boys. Now, I do have a criticism. We'll see in the Out of Frame episode on The Boys. My beef is not with the boys or the seven themselves so much as it is with Vought Industries' depiction in the show, which is as if it is just a private company just off by itself doing something that has no profitable value unless you're a government contractor. And in the show, they're not a government contractor yet. They are in the comics, though, so you get into that whole thing, but that's a whole other deal. Which one next? What do you want to do? You want to do the first one? So how can we build individualism? That's too tough of a question for me to answer. I mean, I think you build the individualistic philosophy one person at a time. I mean, there's no other way that I'm aware of other than having conversations with people, discussing these ideas, discussing philosophy with people, and being kind and magnanimous and as persuasive as you can, so that they believe that you're not ambivalent to suffering, or you're not ambivalent to the things that make them want to abandon individualism, right? Things like fear make people very collectivist because they're like, my tribe needs to be saved from that tribe, and not dismissing that fear, but also saying like, there are other ways of dealing with this, and we need to treat each other as individual people. But I think it's just going to be one person at a time. Is Loki good or bad? I mean, both, right? He's the trickster. I mean, Norse mythology, Loki is probably more good than bad. He's just mostly, literally, just kind of a prankster. But all of the other gods in Norse mythology are terrible. Like Thor is not a good example. But in the comics, I think Loki is one of the more interesting characters in the MCU for me, because he is really troubled. Like, he is somebody who is kind of left out of a lot of conversations. He doesn't quite fit. He is adopted, so he doesn't have the same sense that he is important, although it seems clear that Odin actually does love him, and their mom loves him just the same. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, he goes back and forth. He's a really interesting character that way. I like it. Film certifying boards, I am essentially 100% opposed to. I think you should be allowed to watch whatever you want to watch. You should not have some government entity telling you what is acceptable or what isn't. That is your choice.
Right. We have an interesting question, Sean. It says that how should we as a society deal with art that incites violence or enrages a community? What do you think is the right reaction to this?
I think, first of all, I think we have to be really careful about defining something that incites violence, because legally, in most cases, the idea of inciting violence is incredibly specific for a reason, right? You have to, generally, in the United States at least, and in most places, I believe, you have to not only be directly targeting an individual, and you have to be in a position where the threat is understood to be credible, and your words are very direct. So you're saying like, go kill that person, or go attack that group right now, right? And so I think it's a little bit of a slippery slope when we talk about things that incite violence, when we are actually talking about things that are critical, even really aggressively and negatively critical of other groups of people. The problem, of course, is that really what you're dealing with is terrible ideas, collectivist ideas most of the time, racially motivated, gender motivated, whatever like collectivism you want, country to country even, I know, like Pakistani groups versus Indian groups, or China versus Hong Kong, and there's those kinds of groups too. And honestly, I think that the answer is like, kind of my answer for all these things is just more speech. It's more conversation with people. It's learning how to be more persuasive, and learning how to calm situations down before they bubble over into terrible violence. And it's a little Pollyanna of me to say, but I really believe that that's the only way to deal with it, because I don't think you can quell violence or racism, for example. You can't eliminate racism by being brutal to the racist. Like, you can't do it by going to battle them physically, because they will only get more ensconced in their tribe. And some people, depending on how that goes, will join them because they felt like a little bit of solidarity. Now they see their people getting attacked, and they will join up, So I think it's way, way, way more important to try to de-escalate situations, calm people down, try to have rational conversations as much as possible. And you're not going to get that with everybody, I mean, not everybody's going to be open to it, but as many people as you can, the better it's going to be. And in the meantime, like, be proactive at self-defense. I mean, be proactive at making sure that if there are credible threats, that you're not, you're not a defenseless target, I guess, which is sort of it's a different conversation, but yeah.
Yeah, I think
I don't know. Again, I don't have great answers for these things, because I don't think there are, like, there are no silver bullet kind of answers.
All right. We had an interesting comparison here as well about Shield. So I think this question comes from Vaipam. He says that organizations are formed with good intentions like shields, and their actions led them to be adopted by the government before it is being self-dissolved. Do you think the WHO is an organization that is similar along these lines? We're talking about the United Nations a few minutes back, having good intentions and failing. Because the shield is, in the Marvel universe, it's very authoritarian in its own way. So do you see any parallels about it in today's world?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably put the overall parallel more to the UN than WHO, although I think WHO has the problem of being really beholden to certain governments and saying things that certain governments, China being the obvious example, as if they're happy for them to say it, then they're okay to say it, and if they're not, then they're really self-censorious as a result. And I think that is really dangerous, especially for an organization that purports to be an unbiased, sort of very credible healthcare, and health data organization. That's always disconcerting. And I think we have the same problem with, with a lot of those kinds of entities, especially when they are politically created, they are going to be politically influenced, but I also, again, to not have a great answer for you, like, I also think that, like, these things there's a little bit of an entropy aspect to this where they'll all kind of go that way eventually, because the pull of power and the pull of trying to influence power is really, really strong. So at some point, any organization that wants to grow, and especially if they seek governmental power, if they seek influence over government, will have to adopt stances that the government and the political figures want. So that's always the risk of being in that position. Of course, it's a way bigger risk if you're the UN and you were founded by governments and politicians. So you're starting right off the bat from that. So
Right off the bat. Right. This is an interesting question, John. So it says we are witnessing in today's digital age that in case of art, we see that more people, social media influencers, are getting more credit, and but same time, you also see, let's say, drop in artistic quality. So what are your thoughts on this? Because art today is being more and more digitized. So any thoughts on that?
um well, so I have two sides of this. I actually don't think art is dropping in quality. There's just more of it. So you can see really, really, really great art. It's just not, but what I do agree though is that the algorithms on YouTube and Facebook and stuff don't necessarily reward that. So you end up getting that on subscription services on, HBO or on Netflix or Hulu, like the things that you pay for are producing really, really good shows. I just started watching on so many streaming services now. Peacock, I just started watching Brave New World, which is written by Grant Morrison, who wrote All-Star Superman, by the way. And I've been enjoying it quite a bit. I'm thinking about doing an Out of Frame episode on it. There's some challenges to doing it, but it's obviously a classic dystopian work, and so far it's been a pretty good show. But no, I think there's tons of really, really excellent art. But to the bigger point of algorithms, I do worry about algorithms because they do tend to reward clickbait over substance a lot of the time. And I've had to adopt different strategies for thumbnails and titles and things like that in order to get to just deal with that problem, Veritaserum did a good video several months ago, maybe 8 months ago now, but it was sort of about YouTube's algorithm and how it worked, and it changes all the time. But the end of that video was Veritaserum, like the guy going like, basically, I apologize, I don't really want to do this, but you're gonna start seeing more clickbaity titles from me because it's the only way to pass the algorithm's like initial filters. Like click-through rates really important, like time viewed is really important, which is more something that is about the quality of your video or the quality of your presentation. But that initial thing of like actually clicking on the video when it's recommended is so critical to it getting recommended to more people. And that inherently pushes a clickbait kind of strategy. And a lot of people are good at clickbait, but aren't good at making videos, or a lot of people are good at making flashy, sensational headlines, but the articles don't have the substance to really back it up. And it is a big concern. And I don't really have a solution for it yet. I think it's going to have to be innovated. I think the competitors are going to have to innovate their way around it to some extent. And I haven't yet seen an option that really works.
All right. Sean, we have another interesting question, which I think is the last question. It actually says the fact that would the alternative to one organization like the UN be multiple UNs? It's because of the fact that you have collectivist thought in one place, so you have better alternatives in another place. So do you think we should be having more UNs, or should we be completely, let's say, having more decentralization in that part? Because globalization has its own challenges.
To be honest, I'd rather the centralized bodies got out of the business of standing in between people. Like, I think this Zoom call is a way better example of what the world could achieve than more UNs, because all of those bodies are very top down, they're very centrally controlled, and they say like, well, you have to go through us to negotiate a discussion with some other country, which I think is a little silly when we live in a world where like people from different countries can literally just talk to each other. Like we could just have a world where anybody from anywhere could have a conversation with anyone, and that would be better to me than having an intermediary.
Sean, we have 2 more minutes, so it closes. Would you like to give any closing remarks? There's a lot I could talk about. In fact, there's a lot we could talk about, but due to time constraints, and thank you so much for coming. But would you have any closing remarks from your side?
I don't have really any like additional things to say besides what we've already talked about. I guess I would say, if you haven't seen Out of Frame, you can check that out at youtube.com/feeonline. Also, we have a bunch of other shows, Sense Soapbox, Revolution One, and you can find all that stuff at fee.org. So it's pretty easy to go either to fee.org or fee.org/shows, and you'll find all those things. The other thing I guess I would say is if anybody wants to talk to me more about this kind of stuff, I know there's some questions we didn't get to or whatever, but feel free to email me. I'm always it may take me a couple days to get back to you, but smalone@fee.org. I'd be happy to take anybody's additional questions. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. Just one last question since we want to talk about it. I think it was the Avatar part, which you're a big fan, and I'm a big fan. So yeah. I wanted to ask you on Avatar, like, why is it such a great show to you? I mean, you've already spoken about it on our frame, but it's such a great show. I mean, I watched it 3-4 times. So now,
it is a brilliant show it's firing on every single level. The narrative is phenomenal. Like the actual plot of the story is super interesting. The stakes are really, really high. It's developed really well. It's paced really well, but it's also super character driven. And every one of the core characters, especially, but even a ton of the supporting characters are really well defined, and they are all really interesting. Like you could describe, I'm sure anybody who's seen this show, if I ask you who Toph is or who Sokka is, you would tell me a detailed description of who they are as people. They are not two-dimensional characters. They're not little paper people. Like, they're really well-developed characters. And then it's also just so well animated and fun. And like the world building is so interesting, and stuff like flying bison, 6-legged flying bison and winged monkeys and all kinds of stuff like that. It's just brilliant. Like, but yeah, and then as I kind of put in the Out of Frame episode, it also tells a great story about individualism versus collectivism, and I think it's a really, really important message today. So I'm glad that people are watching it on Netflix right now. It's been kind of great.
Yeah, it's been a huge thing actually. We're even like, I've been reading the comics as well. I've been wrapping up the comics with Zuko's mom, and then like with Toph's journey. It's a really good stuff happening out there. Sean, last thing for all of us, like, could you suggest some new comic book series or TV shows to watch? I mean, You said it's a Peacock and Brave New World. I wrote it down.
Yeah. So Brave New World, it's a very adult series, lot of nudity right off. So be forewarned about that. I don't know what your audience is interested in, but I will say one of my favorites that's on anything right now is Doom Patrol. It's into its second season, and both seasons are really, really good. It's weird. It's off the wall. It's very, very strange, but I absolutely loved it. I also just rewatched Carnival Row, which I liked. I've rewatched a couple times since it's been out, and every time I've liked it more. And it also has a lot to say about. We're actually going to put out a short, out of frame short on Carnival Row in the near future, next week actually, I think. So. Yeah, those are some recommendations. Doom Patrol though is kind of my top right now. It's just such a brilliantly created and crafted show.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sean. Time's up. I wish we could really conversate again and again, but I hope to have you soon again. Thank you so much for making it another morning. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We had a great time. Try to have Sean next time as well. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.